I think more likely, though, than the law changing dramatically because of this is what you alluded to earlier, which are these lawsuits. That seems like a more realistic path to Trump actually getting his rights restored.
Yes,
under the Second Amendment.
I think I mentioned the 11th Circuit has upheld the felon in possession ban, but the Ninth Circuit in March held that it was unconstitutional as applied to a particular nonviolent offender. And of course, these are nonviolent felonies that Trump has been convicted of. So there is a little bit of a circuit split, which means there's a non-trivial chance the Supreme Court could be asked to step in and decide whether.
Yeah, there's also the Third Circuit as well, right? With the range ruling on that was the guy who lied on the food stamp form.
Did they restore his? I can't remember the details of that one.
It was an as-applied challenge, similar to the California one, where essentially range lie in the 90s. He lied on a application for food stamps, which was a state misdemeanor in Pennsylvania, but was one punishable by up to 2 years in prison. So it activated the felon in possession statute at the federal level. And so he's been unable to possess guns since then. And the Third Circuit, and it's definitely a panel. It might have been en banc as well. I can't recall off the top of my head. But the Third Circuit, the last ruling on that was that the law was unconstitutional as applied to range in particular, because he was a nonviolent felon. There's no dangerousness. And then you mentioned Rahimi earlier, which is sort of the other side of the coin here, because Rahimi is a case about a domestic violence restraint, somebody who's subject to a domestic violence restraining order who was arrested with a gun after he went on an unrelated crime spree. They searched his house and found a firearm, which I think goes to the constructive possession part. They've just found a gun in his room, essentially.
I'm really hopeful that the Supreme Court takes Rahimi as an opportunity to clarify the Bruen standard, because the point in Rahimi in the Fifth Circuit, which struck down the domestic violence offender ban or restraining order ban, because they said, look, the founding era had no analog for this. They didn't disarm abusers back then, and they didn't disarm them when the 14th Amendment was ratified either. So the Supreme Court now needs to tell us, how are we actually supposed to look at this when we're looking at things like the domestic violence? I mean, domestic violence was just not something that was prosecuted back then. It was something that was just existed. They put up with it, which is deplorable. And does that mean that Congress? Does that mean that Congress really can never regulate domestic violence offenders or suspects in this manner? I would hope not, but that's the way that Bruen points. And the Supreme Court needs to tell us a little more about it. And in doing so, they can also probably tell us a little more about how we should be analyzing the felon in possession ban, and for Hunter Biden, the drug user ban.
Yeah, and if you listen to the oral arguments in Rahimi, which happened back, I think it was in November, so we've been waiting quite a while on this case. It's probably going to be out in June sometime, I would expect. But the oral arguments pointed to, again, the other side of the coin, the nonviolent versus violent, or dangerousness as being perhaps the standard they might go with. There was some precedent for this from Justice Barrett, who wrote in a case called Cantor that
when she was on the Seventh Circuit,
yeah, it was kind of an aside, but she set up this whole dangerousness standard in a dissent where she said that people who aren't dangerous, people who aren't felons, shouldn't be prohibited from owning guns for the rest of their life. But on the flip side of that was this idea that people who are dangerous, or that they could be prohibited. And that's, I don't know, that seems maybe where the court is headed here.
Well, we will know by the end of June.
Yeah, and so that could have a direct impact on Trump and his circumstance, or Hunter Biden too, of course. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the more realistic way that Trump gets back his gun rights, at least within a relatively quick period of time. All the other options would probably take much longer, expungement or his own as applied challenged for himself, or something like that. Those things would take years.
given the timelines involved, I mean, we're going to vote in this next election before we know how all of that's going to be resolved, just because appeals take time. He doesn't lose his voting rights in Florida. He can run for office and he can take office as a felon. There's no prohibition on that. But
kind of a funny dichotomy there. He can't own guns, but he can be president.
He can be president.
He can run the military.
He's the self-appointed leader of the gun rights community, and he can't own a gun right now.
That is a wild thing. We talked about that on the news update as well. The more the political implications of, and not only that happened, but just that it happened without any even really discussion of this possibility during the primaries from either his opponents or the gun rights groups.
Well,
the gun rights
part of that I think stems from people just didn't take these charges seriously enough. I mean, people really sort of treated them as an afterthought to the federal charges or maybe the Georgia RICO case. But I mean, when it comes to the federal felon in possession ban, any felony will do, anything that's punishable by more than a year in prison.
Right. And it happens that these are the ones that popped first, but any of them, and being convicted on any of them would have put him in the same boat. And it's just a bit odd that nobody thought that worthy of discussion on the gun rights community. I mean, because now the choice is between, somebody who's extremely hostile to their views and Joe Biden and wants to restrict firearms pretty significantly from this. I mean, he's still running on enacting another assault weapons ban, which would, of course, go after things like the AR-15, which are very popular rifles, and so on and so forth. He's done a lot of executive actions through federal rulemaking to restrict firearms. And then the other side is somebody who can't legally own guns.